Welcome to Books at Berklee. I'm Judy Pinnolis. Today I have with me Patricia Peknik, Associate Professor. She teaches American History and Law in the Liberal Arts and Sciences Department. Patricia has collaborated on the translation of many French language literary and commercial texts and has an enduring interest in French-American transatlantic history. She's written City of the World, a new American exceptionalism, and the impact of 9/11 on psychology and education, the day that changed everything. Welcome, Dr. Peknik, to Books at Berklee.
Thank you so much for having me here.
I have a question about your book today. And first of all, the title, French Louisiana Music and Its Patrons, the Popularization and Transformation of a Regional Sound. I found this to be a very interesting book, not least of which was that I went to college in Louisiana. What was then Sophie Newcomb College, which is now part of Tulane University. So this was a very interesting kind of collection. And how did you first get interested in the music of French Louisiana? What draws you to the music?
Strangely, I got interested in architecture, and that led me to the music. I've always been interested in historic preservation and the movement that took off in the 1930s when Franklin Roosevelt sent federal workers out across the whole United States documenting buildings that were contributory to our country's architectural heritage. Even if those buildings were not architecturally grand, but were regionally characteristic. And in looking at the 1930s, I realized that ethnomusicologists were doing the same thing with music under FDR's Federal Music Project. They were traveling around collecting songs, especially in the rural South, songs that they thought were particularly evocative of a region, a way of life, a shared consciousness. And then I was baffled that there were French language songs in this federal collection, sort of hidden among the blues and gospel songs and the Scots-Irish ballads. And I started to wonder where the French songs came from. And then one of my professors at Boston University, Bruce Schulman, said, well, you teach at Berklee and you speak French, so you must know all about Cajun music. And that ignited my curiosity. It turned out that speaking French was relatively unhelpful in listening to the old time version of this music, as far as understanding the lyrics, because they're in Cajun or Creole dialects of French, meaning these regional languages that were not written languages based on Old Continental French, but then incorporating vocabulary from Spanish, Native American, Afro-Caribbean populations. And they were spoken in this accent that combined 17th century French with a Southern accent. So even though the music wasn't accessible to me in its lyrical content, it's so rousing and joyful and just rushes forward. So I got hooked.
Oh, that's really great. It really is a toe tapping, foot stomping kind of music for the most part. Can you explain to our audience briefly what these terms? There were a number of terms that were. Some people use them interchangeably, but you don't. You make it clear that terms such as Creole and Cajun can be different. And earlier, just quote French, the French designation. In your book, you spend some time explaining these distinctions in the music, and I wanted to talk a little bit about those terms such as Cajun, Creole, and Zydeco. There's so many complex layers. You could briefly talk a little bit about that to our listeners.
Well, there were so many linguistic groups that shaped the culture of Louisiana. There were speakers of Parisian French with speakers of colonial Caribbean French, continental Spanish, colonial Spanish, German, Portuguese, many varieties of English, many religious groups from Spanish Catholics to practitioners of voodoo, many different governments. Louisiana had 7 governments. It kept getting passed from one empire to the next. It was a territory, it was a state. So there are many different words that function in different ways, and the same words get pronounced in different ways. If you look at the word New Orleans, we've all heard people say New Orleans, Nolans, the pronunciations are so different. And so the word Creole about the music means old time French language music of Afro-Louisianans. But Creole in a different context, for example, in New Orleans in the 19th century, meant that someone was descended from French Europeans. Or it could mean that someone was of mixed race. It's very context dependent meaning. And then Cajun historically means the population of people descended from the Acadians who left French-speaking Canada. But people from so many different countries immigrated to Louisiana. And then they became Cajun by learning French and assimilating into Catholicism, into the socioeconomic and cultural folkways of people in that region. Musically, the word Cajun has meant the fiddle and accordion music played by French-speaking people in Southwest Louisiana. Ethnomusicologists and record labels came up with terms like Cajun music, Cajun Creole music, Afro Creole music. But these terms were not used by musicians themselves. Musicians, when asked by outsiders, called it French music to distinguish it from the music that was broadcast on national radio in English.
Yeah, so many complex layers coming together in this one culture and over a period of time really changing. I wanted to mention a story a great story in your book that you talk about that seemed to me to sort of embody some of this spirit of all these things coming together in Louisiana. And that was the story of the origin of jambalaya. And I remember when I attended Sophie Newcomb College, that good jambalaya was an essential cuisine when I lived in New Orleans. For those folks not familiar with this history, can you tell us a little bit about how the jambalaya and its various ethnic groups consider it jambalaya is their dish, and
Yeah.
what that's all about?
Great. Well, just as those federal workers in the Depression were traveling around documenting architecture and music, they were also documenting foodways. What do people eat? When do they eat it? Is food part of a ritual? Are recipes passed on generationally? Are dishes shared at community events? So they collected recipes, and we end up with these wonderful regional cookbooks. People outside of Louisiana see this amazing dish, jambalaya, and they wonder where it came from. You know, that delicious spicy rice and meat. Some people make it with chicken. Some people make it with shrimp. Some people make it with sausage. And it was variously described as developing from Spain, from the south of France, in the Congo, in Dominican Republic. It's Native American cuisine, it's African cuisine. If we look at the oldest New Orleans cookbooks, and then you look at books about plants in West Africa, and you look at the immigration history of, you know, the French Huguenots or something to the Carolinas, I mean, you see that this dish developed out of contact between very different groups, but each group associating it with home and family claimed it as uniquely and singularly its own. But it really belongs collectively to all those groups, French, Spanish, African, American Indian, and each group has a folk tale about how it originated, but it's really everybody's. And I think it's a great way for us to understand the development and the various sort of proprietary sensibility about the music as well as to understand what it means to be American.
Yeah, I thought it was a great metaphor for the music and for this sort of coming together of cultures and literally blending things together that happens in the dish as well, as well as the music. In studying this French Louisiana folk music, a lot of these issues of race, as you've mentioned, come up. And despite these sort of blurry origin stories, where there's neither Black nor Creole or white or mulatto, whatever the terms are of strictly used for the originators of the music, this music is a blend. But I'd like to touch on how racial segregation in the South, long a historic historic marker of the era, the 19th century, changed how this music developed. And also, if you might be able to address some more about this mixing in of, you mentioned earlier about the French language, which is really a not strictly French, it's really a mixed language as well. But how this sort of racial segregation really played into the development of the music.
Yeah, it fascinated me that this genre was developed by Black and white musicians collaboratively. They worked together in agriculture in Southwest Louisiana. They passed tunes and lyrics back and forth. They played together in clubs and recorded together. But I think of the old time Cajun and old time Creole musicians as being like fraternal twins who were then separated. And the separation happens, I think, because of that pressure, because of the outside curiosity. Ethnomusicologists have a sincere interest in understanding where the music came from. They want to trace its origins. So Alan Lomax would say, look, I need to know where this song came from. Is it derived from a medieval French ballad? Music collectors wanted to know, hey, did you learn this song from your grandmother who learned it in Haiti or who learned it in Cuba? And then, of course, there were commercial interests. The record labels were thinking, if we're going to record this and put it on the radio, we need to know what it is and we need to label it. It has to be categorized. And so the question became, does this belong under the category of race records, or does it belong under the category of hillbilly music? The early 20th century music industry really segregated the sounds in order to sell the albums.
Right.
We know that.
Ironic that the music had really been developing within the context of this, as you say, twins coming together. And then we have a situation where it's later with outside groups coming into the community, but saying, no, you have to separate it.
Yes. It's tragic. It's sad. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, it's a very different history than a lot of the United States, and it really has some unique identifiers.
Yes.
So this regional music, its function tells us a little bit about the history and culture of that place in southwestern Louisiana. Would you say that would be the case, or?
Yeah, I like that these outside northeastern urban ethnomusicologists, Washington, D.C. ethnomusicologists were interested in it. They felt like they discovered some sort of hidden republic of music and food and craft and ritual that was really documented in the lyrics of these songs. And the folk tradition, of course, in general, is made up of this creative acting upon of community music by the individual performer who's embellishing a song, borrowing a storyline from one song to create another song. When I looked at the lyrics of these songs, I realized often they tell the story of how important the family home is, how important family members are throughout the entire life of the individual. The parents in these old time songs are often overseeing the courtship, sometimes causing breakups. People are getting sent to prison. They're migrating to Texas. There are rice and sweet potato fields as far as the eye can see. The music is really a repository of information about how these people live their lives in close quarters, but sharing traditions like rural Mardi Gras together. And the music also, as we look at its development up into the 70s, it showed us how the culture changed, because so many people from Louisiana migrated to Texas, and so many people from Texas migrated into Louisiana, bringing country music and swing bands. And so we end up seeing the older musicians kind of hanging on to the old time music, and then the mid-career musicians experimenting with new instrumentation like guitars, and then the younger generation getting into rock and pop but then later on circling back to say, wait a minute, I know where we came from. It's French Louisiana. So it's a really American story, in fact, about migration and generations and exchanges of cultures.
Yeah, it's such an interesting connection that it shows and is expressive of so many of the metaphors that happen to folk music in general everywhere, blending of cultures and the changes that we'll talk about also later. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the connection to dance with this French Louisiana music. It seemed such an essential element of so much of the music.
Yes, in the old Louisiana dance halls, what fascinated me is the similarity in the way dance halls in Louisiana were set up when I looked at dance hall culture in France, in early 20th century France, where there was the same accordion-based ballad music, and the dance hall was the focal point. The band was off to one side because people weren't going out to sit and watch the band. They were going out to dance. So people are in the club watching the dancers. The dancing is the social activity where people from different families and then later different communities interact. And the dance floor is where the courtship happens. So down at Fred's Lounge in, Mamou, Louisiana, there are signs that say, don't stand on the tables to watch the dancers. People aren't watching the band, they're watching the dancers.
Yeah, such an important part. And also, as we said at the beginning, it's foot stomping music anyway. So
yes,
you do want to get up and move to this music. One of the things I was really fascinated in your book was that you included so many nice little factoids, as it were, such as the wrapping of a man's hand in a handkerchief while dancing so as not to spoil a woman's dress, or some of these little customs along with the food customs that we talked about earlier. How can these be conveyed in a totally oral experience of hearing a recording or listening to the radio?
Yeah, what a great question. The music, the dance, the food were so profoundly connected that it is odd listening to a recording of that music sitting in a house in New England. I guess in the same way it's odd looking at a French Impressionist painting in a museum of a landscape of the south of France. The best result of listening to this music is that it makes you want to go to Louisiana and hear it live and watch people dance and eat some good food and have a drink. So as soon as I first listened to the music, I realized I had to be in that physical and social landscape to really hear it. I rented a pickup truck and went to a bar, Fred's. It was 11 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday, and people were dancing and partying. And then I really got it. And so it's not music that I would want to listen to in a concert hall. It's really meant to be part of this dynamic interaction of people in the audience with other people in the audience and other people on the dance floor.
Yeah, it definitely is part of that. I wanted to change gears here a little bit and talk about, in your book, you address the role of these collectors that had come in. You mentioned that they were from the outside. You quote Harry Auster, for example, as saying that collecting is part of an art and an addiction. I love that quote. It rang so true. Can you speak a little bit about the mentions of some of the important collectors of this music that were part of what you looked at and examined?
Yeah, thank you. Because I'm an outsider, so I wanted to see what other outsiders like me saw when they looked at the music and its culture. I guess the ones I like the best, the most ones I wish I could meet are Harry Smith and Ralph Rinzler. Smith is the one who got French Louisiana music into the folk music canon by including some French language songs in his famous anthology of American folk music. He was a wild, eccentric genius who was really addicted to collecting. So he collected records, begged, borrowed, stole them. He also collected paper airplanes. His collection of paper airplanes is in the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. He collected little wooden spools from thread. He picked up and cataloged everything he found, and then he abandoned the collections. He painted, he made films. He was obsessed with the fact that record companies were segregating music into white and black categories. And when he compiled this anthology, he deliberately concealed the racial identities of the musicians because he wanted us to understand the absurdity, the tragedy of the way Americans thought about race. So he was an artist, a man of social conscience, and I think a real stealth reformer, because he believed that if people listened to that anthology, it would change the country. Ralph Rinzler, I think, deserves so much more attention than he's gotten because he's the one who promoted the preservation and perpetuation of folk music in a way designed to financially sustain the folk musicians in the regions where they lived. I think of him as a kind of missionary. He was a Johnson era liberal with very progressive ideas about what we now call identity politics. And he devoted his life to supporting these musicians and craftspeople. And I wish I could go back in time and have lunch with these two extraordinary patrons of the music.
Well, that's really great. They contributed so much to our understanding, because we talk about, what are the roles of publications in preserving and documenting a culture. And so without that, so many of us would not be able to have any access to these materials. There's so many cultures are impacted. When I was reading your book, I was just thinking about all the different cultures I've read about that have been impacted by the very act of these people coming and documenting and preservation, that in its turn, it kind of changes the dynamic or reinforce certain influences of the folk musicians, or does it? I mean, maybe that's not the case here, but how do you feel about that?
Oh, I think it definitely does. It seems like as soon as the music was recorded, it was standardized in certain ways. So instead of learning one of dozens of versions of a song, younger people started to learn that one recorded version that was on the radio, or you had the record, or it was on the jukebox. That's what you heard. So by the time Lomax and Rinzler were traveling around the South recording the old time music, some of those musicians had already moved on because they were imitating things they heard on the radio, especially country music. And some of the collectors and promoters had to talk them back into using more traditional instrumentation. I think in the case of French Louisiana music, the work of this documenting attracted so much global attention that it had to change the music. The French, after World War II, the French were so eager to reassert the importance of global French and French culture. And so they started funding programs to sustain French in the schools in Louisiana and French language music. But the government of Louisiana ended up funding French, not Cajun French, Creole French, but French, continental French. There were people coming from Paris and Belgium to teach it. And I think because of this work with documentation and field recordings, the music, in a way, it was a triumph. It went from this regional music into an internationally popular music that was exported to Canada and France. And the president of France, Pompidou, was interested in sending money and people to support the music and language. But it does change it. Any attention that we pay to any element of culture changes it. It changes people's understanding of what they're doing. It introduces a kind of self-consciousness. It's inevitable.
Yeah, you hear where the effects of the change from a vernacular culture to this more commodified or industrialized, if you will, kind of music that has reflections of the original, but isn't the original. And so we don't necessarily, what we hear on recordings today is unless you're hearing something that's from the original type of music, it's really more or less morphed. Although folk cultures change and morph,
Mhm.
and they would, I mean, it's hard to say how much of that would be one way or the other. I wanted to also just touch on the general US social change, and you mentioned the Johnson era, the civil rights, and all the growth and change in that period of time, and the spread of jazz out of Louisiana itself, another form of music that came from Louisiana, um, and other forms of African American musical influence. How much are those influences coming back into uh, Creole or Cajun music in these new forms, possibly, or
Yeah, it's so this era of the civil rights, especially, has a profound influence on the music because, as you said, it's being commodified, it's being marketed to specific populations outside of the state. So some labels would look at this old time music of a Creole fiddler named Amadé Ardoin, and he often performed with Dennis McGee, who was Irish Cajun. But when marketing the music to African Americans, Amadé Ardoin would go on the cover. And when marketing it to white liberal folk music loving young kids, sometimes Ardoin would go on the cover, sometimes McGee would go on the cover. And there's this anxiety of about influence and about how to keep the music pure. Clifton Chenier in Houston is playing a more funk sort of pop song, and people are saying, is it still Cajun music? Is it Creole music? What is Zydeco music? I understand why in the civil rights era, people of African descent were understandably wanting to reclaim and celebrate cultural practices that had been developed by other people of African descent. And so I understand why the music's getting segregated in that sense, that Clifton Chenier is saying he's an R&B guy and a blues guy, but he's saying, you know, this is Zydeco music, which is Black music. And I suppose I understand how, in the wake of the civil rights movement, Cajuns are starting to hear people call themselves Italian American, Irish American, Polish American, and they are understanding themselves as French Americans descended from Canadians. And they start writing songs about things that happened in Canada in the 18th century. And this sort of pushes the popularity of music, but to completely different kinds of listeners. And again, the common experience of Black and white Southerners creating this music together, it really gets lost.
yeah, it felt to me that everybody is claiming this and changing it for themselves in ways that meet the needs of the then current situation that they were in, and adopting this parts of this to express that. You know, it's interesting how it became expressive to so many people in different ways, and different diverging in different ways, and as it developed. Well, your book covers so many decades of history. Is there one particular period that was the most fascinating for you?
I think if I could, you know, if I could go back in time, of course, I would have loved to have been in New York, in the Village, in the late 50s when Harry Smith's anthology came out, sitting among these folk revivalists. People are listening, they're interested in Dylan and Joan Baez, who are covering these old folk songs. But people were sitting around like Ralph Rinsler was, realizing, wait a minute, this anthology, this music was recorded in the 30s. I wonder if the musicians are still alive. Let's find them. You know, and a bunch of people piled into a station wagon and went down to Louisiana and Mississippi and North Carolina and found some of the musicians and ended up bringing them back to perform at the Newport Folk Festival. So I would love to have been in that time in the late 50s, early 60s, in that liberal decade of progressive idealism that started with the end of McCarthyism and the election of Kennedy and Johnson, under which people yearned, they were curious about how we can take this plurality of cultures and put it together into a culture. And I think we learned so much from that period of time, not just about how music circulates and is regenerated, but about what it means to be American. I keep coming back to that, what it means to be American. That's what I learned from researching material for this book.
Yeah, that really comes across very strongly. I feel that the exploration of what is American folk music in that period by so many people. I mean, we had fought this world war to defend the American way. And what does that mean? And people are still exploring that. Well, is there anything else you'd like to tell our listeners about the book that you'd like them to know or understand?
Well, I wish people would listen to the music. I think it's great because, as you said, it's rousing, fast dance music, but it's the upbeatness is combined with lyrics that are really tragic and sad, and it's a fascinating combination. Some of the lyrics say things like, I take my miseries as they come. You broke my heart, I'm going off to die. There's one lyric where the woman says, when he left me, he told me to take a good look at him so that I'd never get over him. It's a kind of hard times lyrical content with really good time music. So more than anything, I hope that people will go listen to the music. Beautiful.
Thank you so much. I hope they will. And I think when they read the book, they'll get more excited about doing that and have.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.